and welcome to my talk. This is called What a Lovely Pair of Coconuts, and this lecture focuses on specifically the drift seeds that we find of plants of tropical seashores. Now, a little bit of a warning, it's probably time for the little kitties to go to bed. There are some naughty jokes and comments in this talk, and I don't know why, but for some reason probably the shape of these fruits incites a little bit of bawdy humour, perhaps too much time alone on these tropical beaches. Now, I should introduce myself. My name is Damon Ramsey. I trained as a biologist in Charles Darwin University in the Northern Territory and James Cook University in Queensland. Trained as a guide before that, and I get to work on expedition ships all around the world, including many stops on tropical beaches around the planet, which is very nice. I've also written a few books, including one on the tropical seashores, which included a whole chapter on the plants of the tropical seashore, so this lecture is based on part of that. And I also played James Bond in the movie Casino Royale. Look, all right, all of what I said is true except for that last little bit. And I think everyone probably agrees it's quite relaxing to meander along a beautiful tropical beach. And it's always fun to see, sort of what strange sins have sort of washed up onto the shore, what exotic things have turned up. Well, this is a photo of a dead dugong that washed up in northwest Australia, and there its guts sort of spilled out. That was quite a smelly show. Now, in the mind of many beachcombers, such debris sort of evokes exotic locales in their mind's eye, and what people often think of when they think of here's another photo of that dugong. This is the guts, and where all the maggots were consuming the dugong from the inside out. That's pretty disgusting. Sorry, no more photos of dead dugongs on beaches from now on. Now, drift seeds of plants are a very effective way for these plants to distribute themselves along tropical seashores, and they really have distributed themselves a long way. For early explorers, it was a good indication of what was coming up, and when Columbus saw sea beans, for example, he knew there must be a great land lying to the west somewhere. And indeed, these things have spread themselves all over the planet. Now, when we look at the Earth, we look at the main biogeographic regions, and each coloured region here shares within itself a distinctive group of plants and animals, obviously lots of overlap. And I'll cover those regions in other lectures in more detail. Now, that sort of covers the land, but what about the larger portion of the planet, which of course is the oceans? Here we have one of those marine realms. In fact, this is the biggest of the ocean areas, and in fact it's the biggest biogeographic region in the world today. This is the tropical Indo-Pacific region, and it shares similar species of plants and animals. So you get the same species of plants and animals in the open ocean across this region, in the coral reefs, in the mangroves, and along the open seashore. So you might get the same species of beach plant, from the east coast of Africa, all the way across the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia, across the top of Australia, and then 3/4 of the way across the Pacific into eastern Polynesia. So this enables some of the most widespread plants in the world, and they do this by dispersing their seeds through the ocean. Now, some plants are not inhabitants of the land of the seashore, but of the ocean, and when they do wash up, they die. They're not colonising the seashore. So, for example, lots of the algae you'll see wash up on the beaches, such as sargassum weeds, which are very common all around the planet. But what I'm looking at here are specifically the fruits of flowering plants. Now, flowering plants develop fruits which are containers for their seeds. These are essentially baby plants, or the juvenile plants before they start to grow. And different ecosystems tend to favour different methods of seed dispersal, reflecting their particular environmental conditions. So, for example, the tropical rainforests are dominated by animal dispersed fruits. These fruits tend to be quite colourful to attract the eye of the animal, and they're quite fleshy to reward the animal with something to eat. The plants in the mangrove communities, which are quite close to the seashore obviously, and the subject for a whole another lecture series, are reliant on ocean dispersal. One expert states that all mangroves are dispersed by water, but the plants of the open tropical seashore are a little bit different. They're obviously very close to the mangroves, and they're also mostly dominated by water dispersal methods, but not all of them. And there's quite a few different variations apart from water dispersal, including some animal dispersed seeds. But when using ocean dispersal, which most seashore plants do, depending on the sea currents, they can end up all over the world, to the most remote islands at the very edge of the planet. So it's not unusual for tropical plant seeds to end up on chilly shores around the planet, Europe or North America or the southern temperate coastlines of Australia and New Zealand. But of course they won't usually germinate because of the lower temperatures. And these fruits and seeds and seedlings that are saltwater dispersed have a suite of particular specific features if they are to survive. Okay. So some part of the fruit wall is usually fibrous, and this sort of stringy material facilitates buoyancy, floating. They have to be woody and thick so they can travel far and resist water seepage coming in. And they have to be of a reasonable size, so they'll be pretty big. So the seed has to have reserves for the slow and possibly long wait to a suitable site. Okay, and depending on the species, seashore seeds can be viable after floating anywhere from a few days to up to a year. And good examples of these properties in such fruits are easy to find. They can be found along any tropical seashore line. Coconuts are probably the best known example, but another good example is the box fruit, which is pictured here. It's kind of a square coconut, and I'll talk a bit about that later. Mysterious. So on many undisturbed coastal and larger island beaches, you can find the seeds of about half a dozen species of plants in just a few minutes. Creature produce. So some of those families include the Hernandiaceae. Now this is one of the most ancient flowering plant families on the planet. Produce this giant. And it's got quite strange seeds. Some of the sort of strangest seeds you'll see washed up on a tropical beach, and they're quite widespread in the Indian Ocean. And these are the fruits on a tree, still being produced. And this particular one, it's often called the Chinese lantern tree, because they do look like little lanterns, I guess. But they're a funny little thing. They're sort of a soft, thinly fleshed, hollow fruit. So when you look inside it, there's a hole in the bottom, and you can actually look up into the fruit. It's quite a strange looking thing. And inside there's a single suspended black seed. That was thought to look a little bit like a coffin, and so it has the common name of sea hearse as well. Splatty. Then we have the family Rhizoracy, which is a big tropical family and includes the avocados. Poo. When species of laurels or Rhizoracy turn up, and we often call them walnuts in Australia, even though they're not related to walnuts, they've often come from the adjacent rainforest, particularly New Guinea and northeast Queensland, but they can end up all over the world, and they sort of wash up on nearby beaches. And there's lots of different genera. One of the more common families, of course, you'll see are the Pandanus. And in Pandanus, there's hundreds of different species all around, particularly around the tropics of the world. On seashores, they're very obvious and common, of course, but they're also very common and speciose in the rainforest. But I think it's really on the tropical seashores they're most distinctive and most relevant. Well, and when you see a pandanus fruit, some of them are just enormous. They're these giant it's a collection of wedge-shaped segments, and it comes together into a compound fruit. So it looks like a giant pineapple, but it's the size of a basketball. It's the and they are ocean dispersed. However, Cassowary, they do have a flesh, so they are edible for us humans. But you can't just swallow it. You've sort of got to nibble, or you can nibble the inside end of it once it goes red or orange. And they're a bit astringent and they're a bit stringy, and there's not much to them, but you get a nice little sort of flavour hit. But apparently the really nice bit is the kernel inside. I've never managed to be able to crack one open and get to that tasty bit in the middle. It is. And pandanus, of course, are quite colourful, so they are also animal dispersed. Now birds eat and swallow the whole fruit, then poo out the entire thing, and that's what the cassowary does, which we saw earlier. Now with my student groups from the USA, I would often get kids from the south of the US, and so they would call a pandanus, they would pronounce it a pandanus. So when I was showing them what food to survive on, I showed them this one, the pandanus, and it's one you could eat, but if you tried to do what the cassowary does and swallow the whole thing and pass a huge seed out your rear end at once, you might end up with a pandanus. So a good way to remember the name of this particular plant. It's the biggest. Then you have the onion family, rainforest bird. And these fruits are unusual. They are almost onion-like. They're green and round with elongated little pipes at the end, and these often wash up. But more often than not, they split to drop angular, semicircular seeds that are kind of green tinged white with an almost styrofoamy looking surface. They are ocean dispersed and sometimes seen washed up on tropical beaches, although you might not recognize them when you see them in the world. And of course there's the family Poaceae, which is practically all over the world, and this is an important family. How important? Well, you might say extremely important, because it includes the cereal that you had for breakfast, and it includes the bread you'll have for lunch and dinner. And if you live in Asia, there's a high chance it includes the rice that you have for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Now this spinifex is not the arid country spinifex from across the drier parts of Australia. This is the true spinifex, the beech spinifex. So the genus is actually spinifex. And the fruit and flowering heads are at the top, and they normally end up looking like a sort of softly spiky ball. And the flower and fruit heads of the beech spinifex are commonly washed up on beaches. Now, this part of the plant is actually not ocean dispersed, and it in fact disperses by a different mechanism called saltation, which is basically wind pushing it along and bouncing along the ground. They live in rainforests. Now the species common along tropical Australian coasts and southern New Guinea is Spinifex longifolius, but they do. One of the other ones you'll see just adjacent in the Asian islands is this particular one, and it's huge. That's me holding one just to give you some sort of scale. Patrol along beaches in lowland northeast Australia and also around New Guinea. And well, my expression's a bit off here. I think I have to work on my acting expressions for photographs, because my expressions suggest not so much finding a huge spiky fruit, but passing a huge spiky fruit. So within the family Poaceae, it also sometimes includes the bamboos as well. Sometimes separate, sometimes included. So I followed several individuals while filming. And bamboo, a common tropical plant and subtropical, and one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. They beat that kelp that you'll see on documentaries, and they can be recorded up to 90 centimetres a day, which is about 3 centimetres an hour, which is 1 millimetre every 2 seconds. A series of rainforest videos. And bamboo does commonly wash up on shores all around the world, but this is the vegetative part of the plant, so it's not the reproductive part of the plant. So even though they do disperse through the ocean, they don't actually colonize these areas. But quite a few years ago, they do make good rafts. And if you've got good eyes, you can probably see that one of those bamboo poles is a piece of plastic, but they're very good at dispersing humans around the planet and to different tropical seashores. We have the legumes, which is one of the biggest groups of species in the world, and generally they're divided up into 3 different families or subfamilies, including the peas, and we all need a good pea now and then. And one of the classic seashore inhabiting legumes is this particular plant, which is quite spectacular. This is entata, or the sea beans, and they're just massive. I wanted to see them. They include, the biggest seed pods in the world, and they're also often known as matchbox beans around this part of the world, because in the old colonial days in North Queensland, Australia, the old fogies would often store their matches in these seeds because they're waterproof and they keep the matches dry. Eating. And another legume is the sephora, or the silver bush, which is also another very common plant along the tropical seashores. And in fact, it's what we call pantropical, which means it's pretty much found in the tropics across the entire planet, which is relatively unusual. Dispersing, and they also produce these interesting shaped seeds. The plant is also called silver beans because of these things, and you can it's not a very good photo, it's a very old film photograph I took, unfortunately, but you can see that sort of fuzzy look to the beans. They've got a little layer of silvery sort of fur, which gives them the name silver beans, and their shape also suggests the name necklace pod, although to be honest, they kind of look like anal beads to me, or so I've heard. Fruits. And then we have these little things, the mucuna, and they kind of look like a smaller version of the matchbox bean, but you can recognise them by these little dimples or dents in the bean. And they're often called Bernie beans because when you were a kid, you could rub the bean on your clothes and it would heat up very quickly. Then you could press that hot bean on the skin of a girl that you liked and she would squeal in pain. And I'm starting to see why I was never popular with girls when I was young. But it could have been a lot worse. I could have rubbed the girl with this particular fruit. And this one is called the prickly pod, named after an Italian botanist. Now, his wife didn't think he was a prick. It's called Caesarpinium. It's the genus name was named after him. And it's sometimes called prickle vine as well. And there's spines all over the plant. So the joy which this plant invokes resulted in the common name mother-in-law vine. So even a cassowary wouldn't swallow this fruit. And then we come to the family Rhizoracy, which is really dominated by types of mangroves for the purpose. And you'll often recognise these. Their fruits mature on the trees, and then the seeds start to grow and then drop off the trees. And these hypocotyls look like cigars. So on some beaches after a big high tide, the beach is littered with these cigar-shaped seeds. You know, it looks like a big night with George Burns and Groucho Marx and Fidel Castro and Roger Moore and Arnold Schwarzenegger and whoever other old guys you can think smoke cigars. So this. And when they're washed up on the intertidal zone, they've sort of started to grow already on the mother plant, of course. So they hit the ground running. And they initially dropped or washed up flat. But during the very short time they are washed ashore above that intertidal mark, they twist from one end and the other end lifts up very quickly until it is erect. So these propagules that have the faster directions survive. No comment. Talk. We have the family Malvasi, a very familiar one, which includes the figs, seashore. And one of the more distinctive and important plants of the South Pacific seashores and into the neotropics are the breadfruits, which is a type of Xylocarpus. And it's more or less a rainforest island species fruits. But it is important because it is a good staple on some remote islands. It grows relatively well in fairly sandy, depauperate soils. It's a good staple, and unfortunately the fruit is not a nice sweet taste, but it has a kind of mealy taste, which is the name breadfruit. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a separate talk on tropical fruits one day. Then we have the family Kazarinaceae, and these are the Kazarinas, which a lot of people are very familiar with. And they're, again, very distinctive of tropical Indo-Pacific seashores. And now, while the stems make a really beautiful soft carpet on the beach underneath the tree to lie on, they do have quite annoying spiky fruits. And these are a bit of a minefield for the barefoot beachcomber. And unfortunately, it's a combination of pain and pleasure walking underneath a Cazarina tree. You've got the, for the long soft stems, and ouch for the fruits. So when you're walking along a beach under a Cazarina stand, it's, ouch, ouch, and so forth. Filming on people would. We have this family. I can't really think of anything in it that you would know. Often. But on the tropical beaches, you often get the remains of the flower and the following fruits wash up, and these are from the apple mangrove. So it's got a beautiful little star shape, and they're kind of the sepals. It's a persistent calyx, and this tree comes from the nearby mangrove forests. So that's what an apple tree looks like in the mangrove community. Come up and the family Combretaceae. Again, I can't really think of anything particularly well known in this family. Probably the best known thing, perhaps to a lot of people, is this one. Ask me what I'm doing, which is a tropical beech tree. This one is called Terminalia, and they have a quite distinctive sort of pagoda silhouette, which is why they're often called pagoda trees. And they're also often called beech almonds. Now, why are they called beech almonds? Well, here are the fruits. And I'd be honest, and I guess they don't really look like beech almonds, but this one is the most common tree, and this is Terminalia catapa. And it's the most widespread of the terminalias, sometimes introduced in areas as well. Now on the left, you've got the ripening fruit. You can see with the red flesh there. In the center, an older fruit sort of probably floated away a little bit already. And then on the right, you've got an older fruit that's been washed up. But check out the one in the middle. You've got a really distinct boat sort of shape to it, haven't you? Now on the left, you can see the nibbles. And this is another example of a fruit that also gets dispersed by animals that lives along the seashore. So bats and rats probably bite at the fruit. Occasionally a bat would probably fly off with it. And cassowaries also swallow them whole. I've seen their scat along tropical beaches in this area. And then you have a smaller Terminalia, a smaller fruited species. And again, same on the left, you have the ripening fruit, and on the extreme right, the fruits that have washed up on the beaches after a long while. I collected all these little fruits just north of Cairns on the northern beaches. I'm trying to film it. Then we have the family Meliaceae, which includes mahogany, or the old world mahoganies, and the cedars, or again the old world cedars. The Cassowary do a shit. And this particular fruit are quite common when you get big storms on beaches, especially above the high tide mark. Quite chunky, big things. They almost look like a rock. But these are Xylocarpus. and the scientific name alludes to the hardness of the seed or the woodiness. And they begin as large green woody balls, which is why they're called cannonballs as a common name. And they break up into these chunky sort of sections. They break up into these parts while still on the tree. Sometimes they might dehiss, but other times the fruit might fall down and then hit something and then sort of explode in lots of different pieces. Now, these angular wedges are frequently found washed up on beaches along the tropical coast, and they're often called monkey puzzle nuts. So if you want to annoy a friend or a frenemy, get them to try and put the angular pieces back into the original big round fruit. They can't, since they lose the connective parts and the segments shrink and change shape. They never quite fit back into the original ball shape. And here we have the family Malvasi, which often nowadays includes the family Sterculiaceae. So basically we've got the cotton family, including the chocolate family. Oh. And these distinctive fruits are quite common on seashores around the Indo-Pacific, and this is the fruit of another mangrove called the looking glass mangrove. Oh, ew. And it's a really interesting little fruit. It's ocean dispersed, and it has a ridge that resembles a keel. But if you put the fruit down into the water with that keel down, and if the seed is viable, then they would reply, and they kind of, it flips over immediately to turn that keel into a sail. Leave me alone. We have another family which includes the Bougainvillea. It was great. And this family includes another tropical coastal tree that has a relationship between its seeds and animals, but not in the usual way. So this one's a tree called Pisonia, and this becomes, on some remote tropical islands, almost entire forests of this particular tree will take over these islands. You know, I followed it. And there's birds such as black noddies, which will nest in the branches of these Pisonia trees, and they use the large leaves of this particular tree as nesting material. So it's a good way to remember the name Pisonia, because the birds are often breeding in them. They will piss on you, or Pisonia, so a different way of pronouncing the same word. So the fruits are green and sort of finger-like, and they're in an umbel, and there's rows of sticky lumps which produce a sticky exudate or a sap, and this sticks to the animals to aid dispersal. And this would be fine, but swimming away, and the birds become covered in these sticky fruits, and the birds may get so stuck that they can't fly. So many of the birds don't distribute the seeds in the end. So why do this? So the dying bird, it's thought, provides some nutrients for the seedling to grow within. So these bizarre circumstances give rise to various names, alternative names for this tree, such as bird trapping tree or bird lime tree. So we've talked about birds that eat fruits. Now there are fruits that eat birds. They ate a lot. We have the beautiful family that includes the Brazil nuts, scavenging off the beach. And included in this family is a tree called Barringtonia asiatica, which is also commonly known as the Beech Barringtonia, and probably best known colloquially as the box fruit. Sometimes eating. So you can see why it's called box fruit. It's the flowers are followed by this large woody angular fruits, usually 4 ridges, sometimes 5, and the fruits ripen from green to brown and may be found really at either stage along the beach. Dead fish. So they're very buoyant fruits, and they float for years. And they're also subsequently used as fishing floats in many small communities around the tropical Indo-Pacific. Now, once they do wash ashore, if they are soaked by fresh water, rainwater, they will germinate. So what happens is they tend to live in the wetter coasts and forests in this region. This tree and the fruits are often called a fish poison tree. So the seeds can be ground down into fish poisoning saponins, and these saponins interfere with the oxygen intake of fish, and thus it stuns them to the surface, and then you can basically collect them. Wash up. Now we have the family Sapotaceae, which provides chewing gum. And in that family you have the Wongai plum, which is edible with some treatment, and local legend on Thursday Island says that if you eat the fruit you are destined to return, which will be an... The family Opposinaceae includes the famous Frangipani, another, and also includes one of these trees, which is a big genus called Cerbera, and this one is Cerbera mangus, which is probably the most widespread of the species in this genus along tropical coasts. It's often called dogbane or rubber tree, although it's not a true rubber tree. Talk I do. And it is ocean dispersed, but with that bright coloured flesh, it is there to attract someone's eyes. So yes, it is eaten by animals. But what animal? But also... So it is a single large seed, which implies being swallowed and not chewed. Thus it is bird dispersed. But that is a big fruit, so it must be a big bird. And what's the biggest bird? Well, it's the one we've seen already. It's the cassowary. In fact, there are species in this genus, Cerbera, in the nearby rainforests of New Guinea and Northern Australia that are blue and are called cassowary plums. Picking up lots of... So the fruit is poisonous to us. It has a white latex or exudate or a sap, which has poisonous qualities to it. And this is something shared between quite a few other members of the Opposinaceae and the Asclepiadaceae related family. And it's quite nasty stuff, and it's used by some cultures for applied nastiness. Fruits at that. And it contains cerberin. So this is a compound which has got cardiac glycosides in it, which disrupt the beating of the heart. And in some parts of Africa and Madagascar, it's used as an initiation fruit, so you can survive that. You've been initiated. Some other places, people have committed suicide with the poison, and in other places, they use it to murder people that are dropped. So, if anyone here is unhappily married, then I have here your solution. This poisonous compound is difficult to detect in autopsies. Its flavour can be masked by spices in cooking, so it's perfect for spousal murder. And in southern India, between 1989 and 1999, there were more than 500 cases of fatal Cerbera poisoning. Or washed. Now, given the number of couples that hopefully are still listening, if you do suspect your spouse of poisoning you, it can cause the following symptoms. So drop us an email if you're suffering from any of these. Increased wrinkles, forgetfulness, clumsiness, loss of hair, and loss of sex drive. Well, let's face it, if you're over the age of 40, you're probably suffering from all of these. Up on the seashore. But the solution for all that, of course, is the family Rubiaceae, which is coffee, one of my favourite things. So one of the more common and distinctive tropical seashore species is a member of this coffee family. And the genus name was named after a French naturalist, but one of the common names is Beech gardenia, with the gardenias being a common species or group within this family Rubiaceae. It's also sometimes called the zebra wood. Another member of this family is the Marinda, also known as the cheese fruit or noni in many of the South Pacific cultures. And this plant is grown widely across the tropical Asia-Pacific region. It's well known for its high vitamin C content, but the trouble is it does really smell. The fruit's quite stinky. And when I first collected this, I didn't really know what it was. I had a bit of a clue, but I put it in my backpack and kind of forgot about it. And that smell of cheese increases over time, especially when it ripens. Unfortunately, I left it in my backpack for a very long time, and you can imagine the smell when I found it a few days later. And it's not just a cheese, but it's a really bad French cheese which has gone off and Smells like a bad French cheese that's been left in the sun and then stored in dirty socks and then carried around an orangutan's armpit for a few days. So it's a very strong, very bad smell. So the flesh suggests it's eaten by an animal. The smell suggests dispersal by a mammal. But it probably doesn't get dispersed by the ocean, but things like bats between the islands. So it's probably more of a forest plant that grows near the edge of the beach. Here we have the family Clusiaceae, which I think includes mangosteen, if I remember correctly.
So I followed them.
So one of the members of this family is called Calophyllum inophyllum, and this is a very attractive forest tree that grows out from the forest and then over the seashore and the beaches around this region. Particularly common in New Guinea, but also in Asia and Australia. And it's a great name, isn't it? Calophyllum inophyllum, the species name and the genus name rhyme. And this big, large, leaning tree, you can see here a couple of Papua New Guinea kids sitting on it over the water. And actually, it might be the Solomon Islands. But it's one of the most dominant trees in this sort of habitat along the shore. And it's often got quite a scaly trunk. So some of the species in the Calophyllum genus in the rainforest we call crocodile trees or alligator trees.
And filmed them.
The leaves are quite smooth, and the little yellow flowers are followed by these round green fruits, which look like big marbles. They're not dispersed by animals, there's nothing much to them, but they do end up rolling into the water and then get washed up on beaches. And they're quite distinct just because they're so smooth and round.
And here we go.
We have the family Gudeniyaceae, which includes a lot of desert plants in the middle of Australia. But one of the species you do get on the coast is a scaevola, so related to some of these arid plants. But this one is Scaevola toccata, and this one is a very widespread Indo-Pacific tropical seashore plant. And these are the fruits that don't end up on the beach very often, but if you see them on the plant, they're little white styrofoamy looking things, and they probably get taken by a lot of local birds. And finally, the famous family Ericaceae.
I added that.
And here's a funny fruit you might see on the shore every now and then in the tropics. And I guess the best way to describe it is it looks like a dead woody jellyfish in some ways, if it's retained most of its features. And this one's a nipa palm, or the fruit of a nipa palm, once it's been broken up into segments, often called the mangrove palm.
That sound effect.
But what classical tropical seashore plant have I left out? It's really the most famous tropical plant in the world. It's perhaps the most famous tropical plant, and maybe even the most famous plant of all.
So
that, of course, is the coconut.
We'll get back to Cassowary.
And that is in that family Ericaceae.
There's quite a bit.
And coconuts sort of tend to lean over from their base above the high tide mark and towards or over the ocean, often against that afternoon sea breeze. And the reason they do this is to drop and disperse their fruits into the sea.
True.
Now, there are three layers to the coconut that we don't always see. There's the exocarp, which is that smooth, hard outer layer. There's the mesocarp, which is the annoying sort of clingy fibre, which helps the fruit float. And there's the endocarp, which is the combination of liquid and fleshy layer inside. One turns into another over time.
In this talk.
And the first two layers are often removed when coconuts are sold. So in Western countries, people may not recognise a coconut when they see it in the wild. And this often confuses many tourists when they first see coconuts.
Animal dispersed.
And these outer layers provide waterproofing, and they allow the coconut to float. And these fruits have turned up, in various parts of cold parts of Europe, but of course they don't germinate there. So coconuts are often called the greatest sea travellers of them all. And today this map sort of tries to show the current natural distribution, including lots of plantations that are grown further inland. But of course, much of this distribution that we see today was aided by humans in the past, in the recent past.
Fruits.
Now, the distribution along Australia's coast is sometimes considered quite controversial, and lots of people consider coconuts a weed. And Lieutenant Commander James Cook observed it in many parts of the tropical Indo-Pacific, but he had trouble locating coconuts along the east coast of New Holland, or what we call Australia now. And he would often feed the crew coconuts in his travels elsewhere, but he couldn't find them. So it's been suggested that Australia was not colonised by coconuts pre-European colonisation. Now, they no doubt turned up, but did native people eat them all? Did animals eat them before they could germinate and not allow colonisation? No one really knows. In terms of the origins, it's thought today now that it's central Indo-Pacific origins, particularly around the Southeast Asian islands, and then a sort of secondary area from southern India and Sri Lanka. So coconuts have been distributed across the planet by us humans, assisted by Austronesians across Polynesia, by the Arabs between Africa and South Asia, and by Europeans to the Americas and West Africa. So it appears we humans are the only animals to disperse coconut, but many animals do feed on them. And coconuts often wash up in New Guinea and Northeast Australia with these giant holes in them. So what makes these? Well, this particular character, these are giant white-tailed rats that are natives to the rainforest of Australasian area in the tropics, and they can chew through coconuts. I've heard them gnawing at night while I've been camping, and they've been chewing through the coconuts on coconut trees, and they've been recorded to chew through tin cans to get at food. So you've got to be careful if you fall asleep on the forest floor and these guys thought you had something good to eat the night before, they might end up chewing through your face to get at it. And there's another animal that specialises in eating coconuts, collecting them and then cutting through them. And these are the coconut crabs, found throughout more isolated islands of the Indo-Pacific. And these are a remarkable animal. They are, in fact, the heaviest land invertebrate in the world. So coconuts can be a danger. An infamous study claimed that in the South Pacific, more people die from coconut falls than from shark attacks. Now, both are relatively rare, but the latter is enough of a problem to life and property that coconuts in many tropical urban areas, such as Port Douglas, are denutted. In other words, they have their big, hairy, hanging nuts chopped off. And coconuts are common and not worth a lot of money these days. So the story of a married couple on board an expedition ship who were going through their mementos and representing their 50th anniversary, and after reminiscing over photos and letters, they found a big, huge luggage case on wheels, and inside they found a very light but very large piece of luggage with an envelope with $10,000 in cash inside and a single coconut. "What's this?" asked the husband to his wife. And the wife replied, "Well, every time I cheated on you, I put a coconut into the luggage." "Well," said the husband happily, "I guess one coconut in 50 years isn't that bad. But what's the money for?" "Well," the wife admitted, "every time the case got full of coconuts, I'd sell them for $1 each." Anyway, I thought I'd finish the talk with a big pair of coconuts. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you. If you want to hear some lectures on different subjects, I'm adding more every couple of weeks onto my Ecosystem Guides channel on YouTube. And if you want to look up information on different plants and animals from different ecosystems from all around the planet, I run my website, Ecosystem-Guides. So I add to it in my spare time every day. And there's a lot there. It will never be finished. It's an ongoing project, but there's a lot of information there. Anyway, thank you for visiting and thank you for listening.